June 4, 1942. Vice Admiral Keiichi Nagamo occupied the command bridge of the carrier Akagi, observing his planes returning from their assault on Midway Island. Around him, the controlled pandemonium of carrier operations in wartime. The deck crews maneuvering aircraft, munitions teams moving explosives and aerial torpedoes, aviators exiting their cockpits. The early daylight reflected across the Pacific waters, and 4 massive flat tops moved in tactical formation, their decks laden with warplanes. By all metrics, Nagamo recognized operations were proceeding as anticipated. Then a communications officer delivered him a dispatch. 7:28 a.m., the message was straightforward, rendered in precise lettering. 10 vessels, presumably hostile, observed at bearing 010, range 240 miles from Midway, heading 150, velocity exceeding 20 knots. Nagamo studied it repeatedly. His expression, witnesses nearby reported, became entirely frozen, not alarmed, not frightened, simply immobile, as though his consciousness had abruptly ceased registering his surroundings and turned completely introspective. For half a year following Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, this strike element of 4 fleet carriers, had swept through the Pacific like an irresistible tempest. They had struck Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon, Colombo. They had destroyed 2 British capital vessels. They had encountered no substantial resistance. And now here, at what should have been a straightforward mission to seize a minor atoll, there were American vessels where no American vessels should have existed. 10 ships, Nagamo murmured softly, to nobody specifically. His command officers moved nearer. The admiral raised his eyes from the dispatch. "Where are their carriers?" Nobody responded, because nobody possessed that information. The reconnaissance aircraft that transmitted the message, a float plane from the cruiser Tone, had departed late due to mechanical difficulties, hadn't identified vessel classifications, cruisers, destroyers, or something more dangerous. Nagamo addressed his operations commander. "Transmit, determine vessel classifications, and sustain surveillance." On the flight platform beneath, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga had just disembarked from his plane. His squadron had spearheaded the assault on Midway 108 aircraft that had bombarded the American facilities there for 30 minutes. Now he stood on deck, still in flight gear, and presented his assessment to the aviation operations personnel. Additional strike required. Enemy installations remained functional. This produced an immediate complication. When Tominaga's formation launched before sunrise, Nagamo had retained a second formation of aircraft 93 planes equipped with torpedoes and armor-piercing ordnance for deployment against warships. This was established procedure. You maintained a reserve should enemy carriers materialize. But no enemy carriers had materialized. The morning had been occupied instead with unsuccessful attacks from Midway-based aircraft, land-based bombers that struck ineffectively, torpedo bombers that approached slowly and were eliminated. Nothing suggesting a carrier existed anywhere close. Therefore, Nagamo had reached a determination: reconfigure the reserve aircraft with ground attack bombs for a subsequent strike on Midway. That directive had been issued at 7:15, 13 minutes earlier. On the hangar platforms of all 4 carriers, munitions personnel were already engaged removing torpedoes, transporting them to magazines, retrieving land attack bombs. It was elaborate, time-intensive labor. And now there existed a dispatch stating enemy vessels were positioned somewhere 240 miles distant. Commander Minoru Genda, the exceptional air operations commander who had designed the Pearl Harbor operation, remained in his quarters, suffering from high fever. He had been unwell for days, but had declined to be excluded. Now, as command officers informed him of developments, he forced himself upright. "What classifications?" he inquired immediately. "Undetermined," an officer answered. "The scout maintains observation. We await specification." Genda's face, already feverish, tensed. "If there are carriers," he stated, his voice strained, We must launch immediately, regardless if we possess only the aircraft presently available. But Nagamo didn't initiate launch operations. He waited. 15 minutes elapsed. 20. The Akagi's deck was occupied with aircraft returning from the Midway operation, landing successively, deck crews rushing to transfer them below or reposition them aside to accommodate space for subsequent arrivals. You couldn't launch an attack with a deck occupied by landing aircraft. You had to retrieve them initially. And furthermore, the scouts still hadn't identified vessel types. At 7:45, a subsequent message arrived. Enemy consists of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief, apparent and immediate, crossed Nagamo's expression. Cruisers and destroyers, not carriers. The Americans had dispatched a surface element, presumably to engage the invasion flotilla proceeding toward Midway. That was controllable. That was actually precisely the target category his torpedo-equipped aircraft were intended to engage. Except his aircraft were no longer configured with torpedoes. They were being reconfigured with land attack bombs. Nagamo addressed his command group. "Reconfigure with torpedoes," he directed. "Prepare to engage the enemy surface element after we retrieve the Midway strike formation." So the munitions personnel, who had expended the previous 30 minutes removing torpedoes and installing land attack bombs, now reversed operations. Remove the land attack bombs. Restore the torpedoes. It was shortly after 8 o'clock. The Midway strike aircraft continued landing. The reserve aircraft, twice reconfigured now, remained in the hangars while crews labored intensively. Torpedoes and bombs were distributed across the hangar platforms, positioned against structural walls, placed wherever space existed because there was insufficient time to restore them appropriately to the magazines deep within the vessel. Then at 8:09, a third dispatch from the reconnaissance plane. Enemy element accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Appears to be, not definitively is, but appears to be. Nagamo studied the message. Surrounding him, his command officers became very still. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer, moved closer. "Admiral," he stated cautiously, "if there is a carrier, we should initiate launch operations immediately." "With what?" Nagamo's tone was sharp. "Half our aircraft are returning from Midway and require landing. The other half are being reconfigured. The decks are occupied." He indicated toward the controlled chaos visible through the bridge observation ports. "We launch a limited strike with whatever is available, or we wait 1 hour, retrieve everyone, complete the reconfiguration, and launch a comprehensive strike." This was the pivotal determination, the moment that would establish everything that succeeded. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the carrier Hiryu, assessed the same circumstances and reached a different determination. He transmitted a message by signal lamp to Nagamo's command vessel. "Recommend launching attack element immediately." Yamaguchi was assertive, recognized for it, respected for it. He had contended before the engagement that Japan should attack with 6 carriers, not 4, should deploy overwhelming capability. Now he was contending for immediate action, even if it necessitated a limited strike. Launch whatever you have available. Get aircraft airborne. Strike them before they strike you. But Nagamo was not assertive. He was prudent, systematic, an officer who had advanced through the hierarchy by avoiding errors. He examined Yamaguchi's message and reached his determination. Wait. Retrieve all aircraft. Complete the reconfiguration. Launch a comprehensive coordinated strike. It was the doctrinally sound determination. It was what regulations prescribed. It was what his preparation and background indicated was correct. So they waited. The Midway strike aircraft landed successively. Tomonaga's plane touched down last at 8:30, leaking fuel from a damaged tank. Deck crews repositioned aircraft. Refueling personnel deployed hoses. Munitions crews continued reconfiguring in the hangars beneath. The 4 carriers proceeded through calm waters, their decks crowded with planes, their hangars occupied with munitions, their personnel operating at maximum capacity to prepare for an attack they now understood was approaching against an American carrier element that was positioned somewhere conducting precisely the same preparations. At 9:18, the first American aircraft materialized. Not dive bombers or horizontal bombers, but torpedo aircraft. 15 Douglas Devastators from the carrier Hornet approaching low and slow from the eastern direction. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol Zeros circling overhead descended on them instantly. What transpired was a massacre. The Devastators, obsolete and slow, attempted to penetrate through barriers of anti-aircraft fire and concentrations of Zeros. They released their torpedoes from excessive distance. Every torpedo failed. 11 of the 15 aircraft were eliminated. The survivors retreated damaged. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo observed the attack with severe satisfaction. American torpedo aircraft, he remarked to his command group. Poorly coordinated, ineffective. It was accurate. The attack had been courageous, but futile. Not one torpedo struck, not one Japanese vessel damaged. If this was what the Americans possessed, then Japan's superiority in preparation and equipment remained overwhelming. But the torpedo aircraft continued arriving. At 9:25, 14 additional Devastators materialized, these from Enterprise. The Zeros and anti-aircraft weapons devastated them. 10 were eliminated. Their torpedoes failed. Then at 9:35, 12 more from Yorktown. The pattern repeated. Courageous, futile attacks that drew the Japanese fighters down to surface altitude, that displaced the combat air patrol from position, that concentrated every weapon and every observer on the low-altitude threat approaching at deck level, which meant nobody was observing upward. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from Enterprise, commenced his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. Following him, 32 additional dive bombers followed, dividing into two formations. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, depleting fuel, about to reverse course when McCluskey detected a Japanese destroyer racing northeast and determined to pursue it. The destroyer was the Arashi, hastening to rejoin the carrier element after deploying depth charges on an American submarine. It led McCluskey directly to the carriers. Now he dove on Akagi, and the Japanese didn't detect him approaching until he was already midway down. On the bridge, a lookout suddenly screamed, "Dive bombers!" Nagumo rotated around, looked upward, and observed them dark silhouettes plummeting from the sun, enlarging with terrifying velocity. What he stated in that moment, nobody recorded precisely. The bridge erupted in shouted directives. Hard rudder. Full evasive maneuvers. The Akagi began turning, her massive hull responding slowly. Too slowly. The dive bombers descended in a steep, screaming dive, and Nagumo could only observe as they released their ordnance. The first bomb failed, detonating in the water alongside, generating a geyser. The second struck amidships, penetrating to the upper hangar platform. The third struck near the aft elevator. 2 bombs out of 3 released on Akagi, 2 bombs each weighing 1,000 pounds, each penetrating deep within the vessel before detonating. On the hangar platform, where munitions personnel had been reconfiguring aircraft for the previous 2 hours, where torpedoes and bombs were positioned against structural walls, where fuel lines operated and aviation gasoline accumulated, the bombs detonated among fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Secondary detonations tore through the hangar. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes exploded from heat. Within seconds, the entire hangar platform was engulfed in fire. Nagumo felt the vessel shudder. Smoke began pouring from the elevator apertures. An officer rushed onto the bridge, his face blackened. Hangar platform is burning. Multiple detonations. We're losing pressure on the firefighting systems. Before Nagumo could respond, another lookout shouted, The admiral turned and observed 1,000 yards to starboard the carrier Kaga sister vessel to Akagi, the second largest carrier in the fleet, with 4 geysers of water erupting surrounding her. Then he observed the bombs strike, 4 direct strikes in rapid succession. Kaga's flight deck erupted in flames. Her hangar platform exploded. Within a minute, she was burning as intensely as Akagi, and then Soryu, the third carrier, smaller and faster, maneuvering desperately. 3 bombs struck her in quick succession. Her flight deck peeled back like paper. Fire burst from her hangar. 3 carriers struck within the span of 6 minutes, all burning, all doomed. On Akagi's bridge, as smoke began infiltrating and the deck tilted slightly beneath his feet, Nagamo stood immobilized. An officer grasped his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your command. The vessel is lost." "Lost?" Nagamo repeated the term as if he didn't comprehend it. "How can she be lost?" "We were just—" He stopped. Around him, officers were shouting damage assessments. The fire was uncontrollable. The engine compartments were still functioning, but the vessel couldn't combat fires and couldn't launch aircraft. She was a floating inferno. Captain Aoki appeared, his uniform torn, his face severe. "Admiral, I request authorization to remain with the vessel. You must transfer to a cruiser and continue directing the engagement." "The engagement?" Nagamo stated. He looked out at Kaga burning, at Soryu burning 3/4 of his carrier capability, gone in 6 minutes. He addressed his command group. "Where is Hiryu?" "Hiryu is undamaged," an officer reported. She was separated from the main formation. The American dive bombers didn't locate her. 1 carrier remaining, 1 out of 4. Nagamo nodded slowly. "Signal Hiryu. She is to launch all available aircraft immediately and engage the American carriers." At 10:28, 6 minutes after the dive bombers struck, Nagamo and his command group descended from Akagi's bridge and proceeded to the flight deck. The forward section of the vessel was relatively clear of smoke, and the destroyer, the Nawaki, came alongside. Nagamo crossed over on a line, hand over hand. The commander of the Kido Butai, abandoning his command vessel while she still floated, still moved through the water under her own propulsion, but burned so intensely that she could not be salvaged. From Nawaki's deck, Nagamo observed his command vessel burn. An officer standing nearby later recalled that the admiral stated nothing. He simply stared at the Akagi, at the smoke pouring from her, at the flames visible through the hangar deck apertures, and his face displayed no expression whatsoever. Not grief, not anger, not shock, just a terrible blank emptiness. 300 meters to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the initial reports at 11 o'clock. He was in the operations compartment, surrounded by command officers, when a communications officer entered and delivered him a dispatch. Yamamoto read it, his face expressionless behind his reading spectacles. Then he read it again. He removed his spectacles, folded them carefully, and placed them on the table. "All carriers?" he inquired quietly. "3 confirmed heavily damaged and burning, sir. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Hiryu is undamaged and launching a counteroffensive." Yamamoto stood motionless for an extended moment. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matung Ugaki, stood beside him, observing the admiral's face. Ugaki would later document in his diary that Yamamoto's expression in that moment was as if he had aged a decade in 10 seconds. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the officer who had cautioned Japan against fighting America, but then designed the operation that initiated the war, now confronted the consequence of his own strategy. He had gambled everything on this engagement, on destroying the American carriers here at Midway, and eliminating the threat to Japan's defensive perimeter. And in the span of 6 minutes, the gamble had failed. "What is Nagamo's situation?" Yamamoto inquired. "He has transferred his command to the cruiser Nagara. He's attempting to direct operations from there." Yamamoto nodded. "Direct all elements to continue the operation." We will support Nagamo with the main body. If Hiryu's strike succeeds, we may still achieve our objective. But even as he issued the directive, Ugaki could perceive that Yamamoto didn't believe it. The admiral sat down heavily, and for the next several hours, as reports arrived, he stated very little. He issued directives, reached determinations, maintained the appearance of command. But something had fractured. Officers who served with him for years stated they had never observed him like this. Not angry, not agitated, just profoundly, deeply quiet. On Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi received intelligence of the three carriers with a sharp intake of breath. He was on the bridge, preparing to launch his own strike when the report arrived. 3 carriers burning, an officer stated. Akagi, Kaga Soryu. Yamaguchi's response was immediate and characteristic. Launch everything, he directed. Every aircraft we possess. Strike them with everything. At 10:54, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu. At 12:45, they located the American carrier Yorktown and struck her with 3 bombs. Yamaguchi, receiving the report, permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. Excellent, he stated. Now launch the torpedo strike. At 1:30, 10 torpedo aircraft and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu. At 2:43, they struck Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The American carrier, already damaged from the bomb strikes, went motionless in the water. To the Japanese aviators returning to Hiryu, she appeared finished. Yamaguchi stood on his bridge receiving the reports, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that Hiryu alone might reverse the engagement. 1 American carrier damaged, possibly sinking. If they could locate and strike the other American carriers, if they could launch another attack before darkness, if the Americans didn't locate Hiryu first. But the Americans did locate Hiryu. At 5 o'clock, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown materialized overhead. Yamaguchi looked upward, observed them approaching, and reportedly stated just one word. Shimada. Damn. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. Her flight deck exploded. Her hangar ignited. Within minutes, she was burning as intensely as the other 3 carriers. Yamaguchi stood on the bridge as smoke poured in, as the deck tilted, as officers reported that the fires were uncontrollable. He addressed his command group. All personnel will abandon vessel. I will remain. His command officers protested. Captain Tomio Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, stated he would remain as well. We will stay with the vessel, Kaku stated. Yamaguchi shook his head. The command group will transfer and continue operations. That is a directive. But he himself would not depart. He was the carrier division commander. These were his vessels. 3 had burned and sunk. The 4th was burning now. He would not survive them. As the sun descended on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sunk. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled by torpedo the following morning. Kaga sank in the evening. Soryu sank at 7:13 in the evening. Hiryu burned through the night and sank at 9:12 the following morning. With them went 248 aircraft, 3,057 personnel, and Japan's capability to project power across the Pacific. On the cruiser Nagara, Nagamo sat in a borrowed compartment, staring at nothing. Officers came and went, bringing reports, requesting directives. He responded mechanically, issuing the necessary commands, but witnesses stated he seemed absent, his consciousness somewhere else. At one point, an officer heard him state very quietly, as if to himself, "How did they know? How did they know we were approaching?" It was the correct question. The Americans had known because they had broken Japan's naval encryption. They had intercepted the messages, understood the plan, positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, and waited. Nagamo had proceeded into an ambush, believing he possessed surprise, believing the Americans were responding to him, when actually they had been waiting for him all along. Every assumption he had formulated, that American carriers were distant, that Midway was lightly defended, that Japan still possessed the initiative, every assumption had been incorrect. On Yamato, Yamamoto received the final reports as night descended. All 4 carriers lost. The American carriers still operational. The invasion of Midway impossible without air coverage. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, he issued the directive. Occupation of Midway is canceled. All elements will withdraw. Ugaki, standing beside him, observed the admiral's face as he issued the directive. He appeared, Ugaki documented later, like an officer who had just authorized his own death sentence. Yamamoto had promised the Emperor and the Naval Command Staff that this operation would destroy the American carrier element and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. Instead, he had lost 4 carriers and gained nothing. The war, which Japan had been winning for 6 months, had just reversed. In the weeks following Midway, as the magnitude of the disaster became apparent, Japanese naval officers struggled to explain what had transpired. How had 4 carriers been destroyed in 6 minutes? How had the Americans materialized at precisely the correct location at precisely the correct time? Some attributed bad fortune, the delayed launching reconnaissance plane from Tone, the determination to reconfigure the aircraft, the timing of the American attacks. Some attributed Nagumo's caution, Yamaguchi's separation from the main formation, the doctrine that required recovering aircraft before launching an attack. But in private conversations, in correspondence and diaries, a different realization emerged. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, the air operations officer who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and who spent the Battle of Midway in Akagi's sick bay recovering from appendicitis, documented later, "We had assumed we possessed the initiative. We had assumed the Americans were responding to us. We had assumed surprise was on our side. Every assumption was incorrect. They knew we were approaching. They were waiting for us. We proceeded into an ambush believing we were the hunters when we were actually the prey." This was the fundamental shock, the realization that shattered Japanese confidence. For 6 months, the Kido Butai had operated with impunity. They had struck where they wanted, when they wanted, and the enemy had been powerless to prevent them. That era concluded at Midway. The Americans had not just won an engagement. They had demonstrated that they could interpret Japanese intentions, predict Japanese movements, and position forces to counter them. The entire Japanese strategy, rapid expansion, defensive perimeter, force preservation, depended on maintaining the initiative. At Midway, Japan lost it and never regained it. Nagumo returned to Japan in disgrace. Though he was not formally disciplined, he was assigned shore commands, kept away from carrier operations, and eventually dispatched to Saipan, where he committed suicide in 1944 as American forces overwhelmed the island. Yamaguchi went down with Hiryu, one of the few Japanese admirals to perish in combat. Yamamoto continued as commander of the combined fleet, but was killed in April 1943 when American fighters guided by diluted messages intercepted and shot down his aircraft. But on the evening of June 4, 1942, as 4 carriers burned and sank into the Pacific, the Japanese admirals who witnessed the disaster struggled to articulate what they experienced. It wasn't just shock at the losses, though the losses were catastrophic. It wasn't just fear of the consequences, though the consequences would reshape the war. It was something deeper, the sudden vertiginous realization that everything they believed about their position, their advantage, their inevitable victory, was incorrect. Captain Aoki, who survived Akagi's sinking and was rescued from the water, was asked years later what he remembered most about that day. He thought for an extended moment. "The silence," he stated finally. After the bombs struck, after the explosions, there was a moment of complete silence on the bridge. We all just stood there looking at each other, and nobody stated anything, because what was there to say? We had just observed our entire strategy burn. That silence, that moment of stunned realization, was what the Japanese admirals experienced at Midway. Not a dramatic pronouncement, not a theatrical reaction, but a quiet, terrible understanding that the war they thought they were winning had just turned against them, and there was nothing they could do to turn it back. What do you think of this incredible page of history? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for your attention, and if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel for more discoveries.